I want to make you aware that next week things are going to change up a little bit. The college class will start again, which will be in this actual room here. We've also mentioned in the bulletin and from the announcements that we will be doing a bilingual class as well. Marlon Rotana is going to be teaching that. And so we've got to move some things around a little bit to get a place for everyone. So this Galatians class, starting next Sunday, will be in the auditorium. We'll have to meet back in the auditorium. We'll close off this partition, and Marlon and the bilingual class will be over there. And then the college class will be here. The spiritual growth class will be there. It's as elders keep saying, it's a good problem to have that we have these other classes and more people have a broader interest and so forth. But the bilingual class, I don't know if any of you are interested in that. It's partly like a English as a second language class. So you're going to be helping the mostly Spanish speakers learn conversational English while doing Bible studies. And if you're somewhat of a Spanish speaker, Joe and I were talking about a little ago, wish we had started Spanish classes years ago. Would have been helpful, but now I think our brains are too hard, our heads are too hard to learn anything. But if you know some Spanish and want to get conversational Spanish through Bible studies, that might be a class that you're interested in. So that's what that bilingual class is about. Obviously going to be studying the Bible with Marlon, and he's a great teacher from the times that he's already taught the English classes. If you go in there, I know that would be a great treat for you. And that will be on that side of the room, or that side of this wall here. And then, of course, the college class will be where it normally is here in what we call room 12. And then the Galatians class will be in the auditorium. So next week we will be meeting in there. And what we'll probably do is I'll get the little podium out and we'll pick 2 sections. So don't do all 4 sections. Just do I'll say right now the middle 2 sections. Don't get in those far outside ones. Even if that's your regular Sunday morning seat, come into the middle 2 sections. And I'm also going to push us toward the back. So I'm going to say we would probably all fit in the back 5 pews. So we'll probably sit in those back 5 on each side. So 10 pews. If we need more, I can move the podium back, and front row Joes can become second row Joes, and we can fill in that the next one. So, just make it a little bit easier, so we're not having to yell across the auditorium at one another if we're making a comment. Any questions on that, or comments? I think that's the way we decided as elders, David. Isn't that what we decided? Yeah. So, we didn't know how big Marlon's class was going to be. We had some alternatives if it was going to be small, but it looks like it's already sitting about 10 or 12 that are interested, so we definitely need a bigger space than what we had. So we'll go from there. All right, Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. I was looking at the calendar and trying to get everything adjusted. If we finish chapter 3 today, we're on schedule to finish Galatians by the end of the quarter. So we want to do that. We did start. We got a couple of verses last week. Well, oh foolish Galatians, and I think I mentioned that the word foolish here comes from the word for mind, noeo, to think or to have a mind, and it has the negative in front of it, the alpha negative. So what it's saying is that you have no mind, or you're not thinking, and that's the idea of foolishness. And what's important to understand here is Paul is not calling them, saying to them that you do not have the capacity to understand these things. He's saying that these things have been presented to you, but you have either been led astray away from them, or you have forgotten them. One of the things that Peter and Paul both mention in their letters is they'll say something like, I say these things to stir you up to remembrance, right? And it's Thomas Jefferson's famous 3 R's of learning. Remember, repetition, repetition, and repetition. We need that kind of repetition, and that's kind of what Paul is going into here. So, oh, unthinking or foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? And that's the who cast a spell on you. I cast a spell on you. I don't know who sang that. But the idea is to cast a spell. In De Silva's commentary, he talks about how this was commonly, at this time during the Roman period, there was the evil eye. And it was commonly thought that you could change someone's fate or destiny by giving them the stink eye. We have found mosaics in Palestinian world from the first century that depict an eye, and it's surrounded by different omens and talisman that might ward off the evil eye. So we do know that the evil eye, or the casting a spell of an evil eye, was certainly believed by a large part of the population. So Paul he's using this worldly idea. Now, whether or not he means this word to be evil eye, or the stink eye, or cast a spell, or bewitched you, but the idea was that these Judaizing teachers. Now he says this in a way to bring it back around. Remember, he's talked about his apostleship. He's talked about the confrontation between him and Peter that happened at Antioch. But now he's bringing it back around to you Galatians, right? Yes, this happened in a faraway land in Antioch of Pisidia, but what about you? What about you, O foolish Galatians? Who has bewitched you? Who has caused you to do this? It was before your eyes that Jesus was portrayed publicly. And so we have this idea of public portrayal. What does he mean by this portrayed publicly? Or does someone else have another translation that might shed some light on that? There at the end of verse 1. Huh? Clearly portrayed, yes. Paul's referring to his own teaching among them. That's what he's talking about. He's basically telling them, look, I came to you and I very publicly and very clearly told you about Christ. It wasn't confusing. It wasn't something that was hard to understand. In other words, I know what you were taught because I'm the one that taught you. That's the idea. He was clearly or publicly portrayed as crucified. And that's the work of Jesus. And, obviously here, this is what we call a synecdoche. You've heard that word before. Synecdoche, what is that? Anyone know? Okay, it's a figure of speech in which a part of something is representative of the whole. So in this case, when he says that Christ was portrayed as crucified, we're not to understand this, that the only thing Paul is concerned about is his crucifixion. Because Paul is also very concerned about the resurrection of Christ. He's also very concerned about the teaching of Christ. He's concerned about the trial that Jesus went through. He's concerned about all of those things. But in this case, the crucified Christ, or Jesus is crucified, is representative of the whole of the salvific plan, right? So he says that he was set forth as crucified. He was synecdoche, a part for the whole. Let me ask you this only, or literally, this one thing I ask. That's how the Greek actually fronts this one thing. This one thing I ask. Now, someone count the number of questions he asks. They're all very related, right? But he says, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? That's another question. Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Question. Does he supply the Spirit to you and works miracles among you? So by works, the law, or by hearing of faith, just as Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him as righteousness? So did Paul forget from verse 2 when he says, this one thing? And the emphasis on one in Paul's statement, and then these questions. Look. Yeah. So the original is tutamanon, which is going to be this only I ask. Is let me sure on the I ask thing. So this only I ask. But I think, even though it's a series of questions, the overall gist of these questions is the same. And it's a question about their spirituality. Does it rely on works of the law, or does it rely on the hearing of faith? That's the contrast that he has here. So even though it's a series of questions, they're all a series of questions about basically the same thing. In fact, in verse 2, he says, this by the hearing with faith, which he repeats that very same statement at the end of verse 5. So by works of law, or by hearing with faith, and it's the same phrase, out of hearing faith. And some say hearing with faith, some say hearing of faith. It's a genitive, it's properly translated to either way, but the idea is that the hearing is based, or the faith is based upon the hearing. Because of the hearing, or out of the hearing, there is faith that is created. And so that's the idea there. Orrin?
Well, it seems like in Galatians, the recurring clash is like spirit versus flesh. And in light of that, kind of like you were saying, all those questions are essentially the same question. You have it stated one way, but then with every subsequent question, it's a restatement of the first.
Exactly. And so even though it's a series of questions, it is the same basic idea, this, as you say, clash between faith and spirit. And listen, that's a lot of what we're having today in the church, and have since the first century, is this clash between the flesh and the spirit, right? Flesh and spirit, flesh and spirit. Romans chapter 8 is the classic location when we talk about it, is the faith, or spirit versus the flesh. And so it's the same thing that is happening here. He puts it in realms of the law. So are you so foolish? And here's that word foolish again. Are you so without thinking? And so he's not telling them that you can't do these things. He says you've ignored these things. There's a difference between those who cannot reason and those who will not reason, right? We understand. I mean, there are some people, brain injuries or whatever it might be, that they cannot reason. No matter, I mean, you can set it for them 100, they simply can't get it. And then there are some who can get it, they just don't want to. And you'd say, well, why wouldn't someone want to? Doesn't everyone want to know, to understand? Why would someone not want to know these things? Well, knowing and understanding these things takes effort, right? I think Rita and I were talking this morning. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13 says, fear God and keep His commandments, right? For this is what? The whole duty of man, right? We know that verse. Does anyone know what the next verse says in verse 14? Of the making of books, there's no end. And much study is a weariness of the soul. Study, thinking, reasoning, it's exhausting. You know, if you've sat in a classroom and you think, all I did was sit and listen, but you're exhausted when you leave, it's because just plain study can be exhausting. It takes a lot of effort. And what we know about society since about Adam is that if man can get by without doing something, he will, right? We're kind of lazy sometimes. That's why, when we see someone that's a hard worker, we're amazed by it. He's a hard worker. We tend to go the path of least resistance. And education, understanding, reasoning, thought, that takes effort, more effort than a lot of people want to put into it. Then, if they put the effort into learning it, what's the next roadblock? Doing it, that's right. Doing it. It takes even more effort to do it. So, are you so foolish? He's challenging them now to put what they're saying about, remember this goes back to the circumcision of the flesh and the keeping of the law, the making the Gentiles into a Jew and then a Jew into a Christian. That's the idea here. He says, are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit, are you now perfected by the flesh? Your faith, as it began by the Spirit. How does Paul know that it began by the Spirit? He taught them. And that's what he would have taught them. That's what he would have demonstrated. That's what they would have received. So you have this clash between the Spirit. Are you now being perfected? Right? There's another idea for the word perfected. Matured, completed, brought to fruition. I love that word. Anytime you can throw fruition into a conversation, do it. But have you now been have you been brought to maturity by the flesh? In this case, circumcision. But he equates it to what? In this context, the flesh. In verse 2, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or the hearing of faith? The works of the law is, in this case, the flesh. In other words, you were Jews, many of you, under the law. You were taught and given the Spirit of Christ crucified, and in that, the overcoming of the law, right? So you were brought out of that into spirituality and a life based upon the Spirit. Now, do you have to go back to the flesh, back to the works of the law in order to be fully perfected? And the answer is no. It's a rhetorical question. What do we mean? What is a rhetorical question? We hear that all the time. Does everyone know what a rhetorical question is?
You ask a question, but answer is obvious.
Right. It's a question that you ask, but the answer is so obvious that it really needs no answer because everyone understands it. So the question is did you begin in the Spirit and have to be perfected by the flesh? And the obvious answer is, well, no. We began in the Spirit. We should continue in the Spirit, but they were not doing that. Did you suffer so many things in vain? If indeed it was in vain. The word vain, in verse 4, what does vain mean? Empty. Did you suffer so many things in an empty way? What things? Well, the things that they had suffered. Remember, he said that people were teaching them another gospel, that they have experienced some, what's the word I'm looking for? Persecution. Did you suffer and endure all that persecution for no reason at all? If indeed it was for no reason. If you have not gone too far away, the idea. Does he who supplies the Spirit to you work miracles among you? Does he do so by works of the law or by hearing of faith? And the he here who supplies the Spirit is obviously going to be God, or we might say Jesus, right? Jesus said, I will send the Spirit. We talk about often the no creed but the Bible, right? You've heard that phrase before, no creed but the Bible, or no creed but Christ. The word creed, anyone know what it means? It's from the Latin credo, by the way, and it means I believe. And so when we say no creed but Christ, we're saying I believe nothing but Christ. Very similar to Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 2, that I determined to know nothing among you except what? Jesus Christ and Him crucified. But there was some value in some of those old creeds. Not to say or set what doctrine was, but to give us language and precision of language that we might understand what the Bible actually says sometimes. I do think there's some value in those old creeds. One of them, they fought over and fought over and fought over, was the coming of the Spirit. So, like here, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, do so by works of the law. So the question is who is the he? Is it God? Is it the Father? Or is it the Son? And so this was a debate in the late 4th century. And they came up with the Phililoque, which means proceeds from the Son also. For a long time they believed the Spirit only proceeds from the Father. He's only given by the Father. And Jesus, the Son, was a passive observer. But somewhere around 381 or so, they added the statement, and the Son. And so the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, that they are sending the Spirit, which coincides with what Jesus promised in John 14, 15, and 16, that after when I leave, I will send the Spirit, the Paraclete. I will send the Comforter to you. And so that was the debate. But there was a time when people were wondering, was it, did the Spirit come from the Father, or did he come from the Son, or did he proceed from both? And it was determined then, after searching Scripture, that the Bible clearly makes it clear that it's from the Father and from the Son. But this is one of those passages that they wondered about. Who is the He? Who is that? It's Father and the Son, although he uses this in the singular sense. But that was the question. He supplies the Spirit to you. He works miracles, which these working of the miracles obviously came from the Spirit himself, among you. Does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing with faith? Now, hearing with faith becomes almost a catchphrase in this paragraph to indicate the idea of conversion that you had to Christianity. All right, so did he do this under works of the law? Is that how God worked these miracles among you? Or was he doing it by the hearing of faith through this spiritual realm? Again, it's a rhetorical question. And the answer, I guess the rest of the question first, just as Abraham believed and it was accounted unto him as righteousness. The answer is, it was by the hearing of faith. But where does he go? He goes back to Abraham. Abraham, of course, the father from the Old Testament, right? Abraham predates the law. And so this God, who is working miracles, did he do it through the works of the flesh because you were circumcised? Which, by the way, Abraham was. He was the first to be circumcised for that reason, the covenant with God. So he's the progenitor of that. But he believed, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And this is kind of the discussion we ended with last week, was, what does he mean believed? In what way did Abraham believe?
Well, he offered up his son Isaac.
Okay, he offered up his son Isaac.
He was going to offer him up as a sacrifice.
All right.
He wasn't going to question God.
And God said, now I know, right? So, was that Genesis 22?
But I think that verse is from Genesis 12.
Oh, okay. So when we get down here, in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, this is going to be Genesis 12, verse 3, right?
Yeah.
Which is before even that point. So Abraham believed, okay, so we go back to Genesis 12, verses 1 and 2. He says, get you from your father's house and from your kindred unto a place that I will show you, right? That was his, and in you, whoever blesses you shall be blessed, and whoever curses you will be cursed. So he's using Abraham believing God when he said, get away from here. But Hebrews chapter 11 says that by faith, when Abraham received that call, what did Abraham do? He went. And so here's again that meshing of faith and obedience. That true faith, true believing is acting upon what we've been given. Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him as righteousness. And now we get into a whole nother thing, that of imputed righteousness. Have you ever heard that phrase before? Imputed righteousness. So some translations even have, instead of counted here, the word imputed. What that means is that the righteousness of another is applied to you. So here's Dustin. Dustin's not good enough as Dustin is, and so he needs someone else's righteousness to be spread over him so that righteousness is what God sees. So Paul would say in Philippians 3 that I'm not going to stand before him in a righteousness of my own, but in whose righteousness? The righteousness of Christ. So we get this interesting doctrine, which I don't agree with imputed righteousness, that as Calvinists would teach it, which says that you are such a vile, totally depraved person that God imputes on you righteousness so that you can do something good like believe, repent, confess, be baptized. You can't do any of those things until you've had the imputed righteousness of Christ. That's not what the Bible teaches at all. But the Bible does teach, whenever I obey the gospel and come to God, that what God does is He takes the righteousness of Christ and He clothes me in it, right? In fact, He'll say later in this chapter, for those of you who have put on Christ or have been baptized, have put on Christ. We've put on His righteousness. And that's the righteousness that we live showing to God and showing to the world. Oren?
I think the statement in verse 5 about He who works miracles among you is helpful when thinking about the way that the early church, especially those inspired writers, viewed miraculous activities working, particularly when it's put together with passages like Acts 8 with Simon the sorcerer and Hebrews 2 and verse 4. There seemed to be an understanding. They all saw the power of the Spirit as coming from the top down, like moving from an upward, downward direction, not laterally.
Yeah.
And we sometimes almost kind of imply that there was, maybe thought there was a lot of lateral movement, but it seems like in an ultimate sense, they always saw that power as coming from the top down. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. Let me point this out too. Notice in this context, He supplies the Spirit, and I didn't mention this a moment ago, and works. What's and? A coordinating conjunction. It takes two thoughts and it holds them together. It doesn't make them one, but it holds them together. Notice, He supplies to you the Spirit and works miracles. And sometimes we have conflated those two and we say, hey, when you get the Spirit, you're able to do miracles. They're not the same thing. All had the Spirit, but not all were able to do miracles. And so He's making a distinction between them. He supplies the Spirit to you, and He does these miracles, and it comes from, as Oren said, from the top down, from God down to man. And that's an important aspect of it too. Any other comments before we go on? So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. For all who rely on the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by the things written in the book of the law and do them. And so we're concerned about the scripture, and we're doing these things, he says, by faith. And Abraham was a man of faith, but we know that man of faith also means a man of action. We've already mentioned Genesis 22 with the sacrifice of Isaac. It was an action. It was what he did. Whenever he was told to leave his father's house, he went. And so by faith, Abraham obeyed time and time and time again. And that's the emphasis that he's putting on this, is that he did these things time and again for our sake. So now he says that those who rely on works of the law are under a curse. And what's that curse? That cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. And so this is the curse. We've got to be perfect. Who among us is perfect? Right? None. No one was perfect under the Old Testament system either. That's why God made provisions of Jesus Christ being crucified. Because we needed it, right? When we understand what sin is, what sin does, and how bad sin is, that's the beginning of it. We recognize that sin. And then we say, oh no, what have I done? And what can I do to change it? Isn't that what they were asking in Acts chapter 2? Men and brethren, what shall we do? That's Acts 2:37. You remember what 36 says? This Jesus, whom you have crucified, God has made him both Lord and Christ. They've just been convicted of crucifying the Lord, the Christ, the Anointed One. Right? And what do? And Peter gives them the plan of salvation whereby they may come out from underneath the old law and this misconception and the guilt of having killed God's only Son. But if you're going to go back and try to live according to that law, Paul says you've got to be perfect. Because going back means you deny the sacrifice of Jesus for yourself. Right? So it's like when Job had all of these children, his first set of children. And it said that they would often go to one another's house and party all night long, right? And then what would Job do the next day? Do you remember? He would go and make a sacrifice in case during their partying his kids had sinned, right? So he's going to go make a sacrifice for them. What would that sacrifice have done for any of his children that rejected it? Nothing. Dad, you may be going to offer that sheep for me, but I'm telling you right now, I don't want it. I don't accept that sacrifice. Well, it wouldn't work. Jesus died as a sacrifice and the provision for all mankind, but when someone says, I don't want that sacrifice, I don't want what he is offering, then you're left with being perfect. Because even under the old law, there was an anticipation that those sacrifices that could not make them perfect, even though they offered them year by year, Hebrews chapter 10, couldn't make them perfect. There was an expectation of something greater coming, and that was Christ. He had to come. And if you reject that sacrifice, there's nothing else that will cover your sins. There's nothing else that will atone for you. That's it. So now you're left with being perfect and never sinning. And that, of course, from the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 18 and verse 4. You may have a citation in your own Bible to that. You have to be perfect, but they weren't. Now, it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. The righteous. This quote from Habakkuk, by the way, is used several times. Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, but is another place. The just shall live by faith, or the righteous shall live by faith. Those who are going to be counted among the righteous, they are righteous and alive because of their faith. If they do not have the faith, then they will not be alive. They will not have that spiritual life. And, by the way, they won't be counted as the righteous. So it's an absolute. The righteous will live by faith. And you take out any part of that equation, and that absolute truth becomes nothing. Because the law is not the source. Remember that God has always been the source. And what is it? Luke, maybe 17, where Jesus makes a statement about it. He said, all right, in the end, we've all done what we were supposed to do. And when we've done everything that we're supposed to do, that God tells us to do, we are still unworthy servants. We still don't deserve what God is going to give us, even if we kept the whole law perfectly. We're still unworthy servants, he says. We need more. We need what God supplies. We do what we can, but we trust in and rely on what God supplies. But the law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. And this is similar to the statement made, for example, in James chapter 2, in verse 10, whoever will keep the whole law and offends in one point is guilty of all. If you're going to be justified by how you keep the law, if that's your expectation, and you reject the sacrifice of Christ, I'm just going to be good enough. He said, the only way to be good enough is to be perfect. There's one man that did that, right? Jesus. So if I've kept everything and offended one spot, one law, one time, I don't even have to keep doing that, just one time that I miss it. I'm guilty of everything. And we hear that and we think, oh man, I've got no hope. Yes, you have no hope. If you expect to be saved because of how good and righteous you are, you have no hope. However, if you understand salvation as a work of God through Jesus Christ and accept His blood and His righteousness, you have all the hope in the world. You have everything. Not so that you can live and do whatever you want, that grace may abound, Romans 6:1. But that as I'm living and as I'm striving and as I'm seeking to please God with a life as close to His Word as I can possibly get, I'm not concerned about my shortcomings because God's got it covered. Hileshderon, it's the word that's used for atonement. It's not used oftentimes in the New Testament, but it's atonement. And Martin Luther, not King, Martin Luther, the reformer, said atonement. In fact, he's the one that came up with the word atonement. And he even defined it as being at one with, the idea of being at one with God. That's atonement. But atonement literally has the idea of a covering. Right? A covering. And it's used for the idea of atone for sin a couple of times in the New Testament. But it's also used to describe the lid on the ark. Right? You know, the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament, and it had a lid. Do you remember what the lid's name was?
Mercy seat.
The mercy seat. That's right, the mercy seat. This was the place where you came, where this was God's throne. He, in a figurative sense, sat between the angels with their outstretched wings. That was the mercy seat. It was the atonement. It was the covering over. And do you remember what was inside the Ark, the covenant? The manna, 2 pots of manna, right? The old tables of stone and Aaron's budding rod, right? And that you think about, the manna, which was God's providence. That was remember, and they actually, there was a term in the Old Testament that always referred to that as the testimony. The contents of the ark were the testimony of God. It was the witness of God that I have supplied for you in the manna. Right? I have led you in the staff of Aaron. And I have trained you or guided you in the paths of righteousness by the law. And yet when we fail those things, it's all still atoned for in the blood of Christ. That's a freebie. Okay. I love that idea, but that's the idea of that's what we look to. Not because I live so perfectly, because I'm not perfect enough, and I never can be perfect enough, but He is, and what He offers is enough for us. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. That is written, as it is written, cursed is everyone who hanged on a tree. And so there's this picture of the curse of what we might say the crucifixion from Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. And so that becomes this curse of the law to live perfectly from man's side of the covenant. Remember, the law is also referred to as a covenant. What's a covenant? If we made covenants today, it's a contract between two. God says, if you'll do this, I will do that. Right? And then if, it's like you're going buying a car. and you say, I agree to pay $1,000 over 5 years for this car. That's a cheap car. But you agree. Now, if you stop making payments on that car, you break your side of the contract, then whoever sold you the car can say, you know what, I'm coming back and get the car. It's my car now because you have failed to keep the contract. There is a covenant between man and God. The man will behave in a certain way and God would behave in a certain way. But man broke that covenant. And God said, okay, let's try again. And man broke it again. And he said, let's try it again. And he broke it again. And he kept giving man this opportunity to get it right. And he just seemed to always fail. He was under that curse of trying to be perfect when he couldn't be perfect. And perfection was necessary. Necessary not to invoke the holy wrath of God. But Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. That he lived under that curse, under that obligation for man to be perfect. And he did it. And then he took the guilt that was mine because of my sin and your sin, and he carried that with him to the cross. Hence, cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. And here again, the promised Spirit. God is sending His Spirit to His people. In fact, the possession of the Spirit is the mark of a Christian even today. What does Romans chapter 8 say? If you do not have His Spirit, what? You're none of His. You're not His. You're not a Christian. You don't belong to God if you don't have God's Spirit. So when we obey the gospel, He gives us His Spirit. How? Through faith. And this faith, we could say, is another synecdoche to mean all that is included in faith and obedience before God. To give a human example, Paul says, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Ratified, that's the signatures, right? You're in the dealership, you sign the paper, you sign your life away. The dealer signs their life away. We agree to let you keep the car. So you go your 5 years, you've made every last payment, and the dealer says, all right, we want more. So no, the contract said, this amount, and I've paid it. It doesn't matter what the contract says, we want more money from you, or we're going to take your car back. You say, no, we're going to court over this because I fulfilled the contract. You don't change the terms of the contract after it's already been signed, after it's been ratified. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. Paul makes this argument simply based upon the plural nature of the words, right? He doesn't say to your seeds, offsprings. He's not talking to you Jews. He's talking to one in particular, which he says is Christ. Christ crucified. All right. And this is what I mean. The law which came 430 years afterwards does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. The law which came 430 years after what? What promise? The promise to Abraham, that's right. And the promise to Abraham was sealed with the token of a covenant, which was what? Circumcision, which is the crux of this whole issue, right? And he says that the covenant that he made with Abraham, the promise he made with Abraham, and sealed by circumcision, is not changed by the law which comes 430 years after, right? So this is after the time in Egypt, the sojourn, the captivity where they're in bondage. All of that's the 430 years. So the law, which is at Sinai, even though it's 430 years later, it does not annul the covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void or empty. That same idea of vanity. He doesn't discount it. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it is no longer comes by the promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise. The inheritance, not just of the land, but I think ultimately of righteousness before God, heaven itself. We'll have to stop there. We'll pick up in verse 19 next week. Appreciate your attention.